So, what we're going to talk about today is taking time after a breakup. But I just thought about this today because one of my students on the Gauntlet program reached out to me and, on the program and said, hey, I've just gone through a breakup and I don't know how to work through this process. And now I really need to find myself before I move into dating someone else again. And this is really, really important. It's something that I think is tremendously relevant for us as human beings in terms of finding a better, more evolved relationship as you move forward. It's not just to grieve. That's one aspect of it. Sometimes in a breakup, it may seem like you're not the only person who wanted, or you are the only person possibly who wanted to end the relationship and move into the next stage. This relationship wasn't necessarily working out for you. On the contrary, maybe the other person broke up with you and now you're left on the back end thinking, okay, what did I do? Why am I in this situation? Why is this not really working out? And the thing that we want to do as human beings is we want to jump into the next thing really, really quick. And the reason that we want to do that is because that is what takes away from the grieving that we're feeling. And when I say take away from it, it actually takes away from, it actually distracts us in many ways from actually being able to process why that relationship wasn't necessarily the best thing for us. So something, I know well from experience in this particular situation, in this particular place, is that I used to be like a serial dater. As soon as I ended up in one relationship, I would jump into the next one. As soon as, I broke up with somebody or somebody broke up with me, I'd look for the next thing, right? And that helps you feel like you're connected to someone else physically, emotionally. It makes you feel distracted by something else so that you don't have to process the feelings of a broken heart. And I've said this twice in this last week. But a broken heart is one of the most important things that you could have at the end of a relationship, as difficult as it sounds, because it really, the pain and the difficulty you're going through are such powerful reflectors for what it is that's really important to you, what it is that really matters to you, and what it is that you really want. One of the most magical things about breakups, and one of the most difficult things about it, is losing the person, losing the relationship. Now, as human beings, we have this thought that when we break up and this person is lost, that we've lost everything. And it's because, and this is what I'm going to tell you, and it's really potent, so listen carefully to this. We have identified, visualized, and imagined our lives together with this person. We've visualized our futures with this person. We visualized all the magic of things we could achieve or could have, or the life we could enjoy with them. And also, while doing that, we're using our present recollection of the times that we've had with them. So based on how we've connected with them, enjoyed our time, the feelings, etc., we're replicating the future. But if you think really carefully, it's not actually the person who's at the center of that replication. It's the times, it's the emotions, it's what you want that you're visualizing, and that person happens to be a really good fit into that space. I'm going to repeat that again. So it's what you want for your future, what you're visualizing, the things that you are grieving when you end that relationship. Those are the times, the emotions, the way you felt, the things you enjoyed, the times you had together, the celebrations, possibly even the extension of their family, etc. But all of those things can be reproduced. The person cannot be reproduced. But the magic is that it's not the person you're actually grieving. It's the things associated with the person. Now, why this is really important is because at the end of a relationship, naturally, grief makes us feel the loss of something, right? It's very important to grieve because then you're accepting the loss of what you let go of what you've, what's gone in your past. If it was so true that the person we lost was the be-all and end-all of everything that we've ever had, then wouldn't all of us not be in any relationships? Because if we had one relationship that didn't work out way back when, we would never be able to move past it. We'd never be able to connect with anybody else. We'd never be able to move forward. We'd never be able to find the next partner. And inevitably, you know what we always say? After a couple of weeks, months, whatever else, we find the next partner and we go like, oh my God, this is the person who I really wanted. This is the person who I really wanted to be with. I wrote about, I connected with, all of those things. And it's almost like we've completely forgotten that the previous person was the one that we were so attached to. So what we're actually attached to, our inner child wants to be attached to the emotions, the connection, the love, the validation, the romance, the traveling, the journeys, all of that. The ego wants to be attached to the person. And there's a big difference between the two. Because by the ego attaching to the person, it makes us feel like we just can't move on. So if we understood that what we're really attaching to is the emotions, the feeling, the energy, the time, the feeling of family, all of the things that that person represents, then we understand that one of them is not reproducible, which is the person. I can't make the exact version of him again, but or her again, but what I can most definitely make is the times, the emotions, the situation. I can attract all of those things into my life again. And that is what ultimately leads to the next question. Okay, so now what is it that I must do for myself to be able to attract a more consistent, more stable, more steady, more loving, more fulfilling, more giving, more replicatable version of those emotions? And that's ultimately what leads us to evolve. That's ultimately what gets us to say, okay, what is it that I attracted in that particular time? Who's the partner that I brought in, the situation that I brought in, etc. And now what is it that I can attract that's going to be able to serve me moving forward? So after a breakup, it is very important to spend time with yourself. It's very important to sit back, to be able to feel the pain, not to just drown it out, not to just ignore it, not to just say, okay, what's coming next? Let me go distract myself. Let me go travel. Let me do anything. If you're doing any of those are important and those are good for you. If you're traveling, you're getting stimulation, but don't let the stimulation distract you from the lessons. Because relationships, and I've always said this to people, relationships are the number one way that our own personality, our own traits, our own wounds, and our own growth are reflected back to us. So if you look at your relationship, case in point, let's take an example, your previous relationship, right? Just sit with all of you, just sit with yourself and think about your previous relationship. Maybe even you can think of the present one, but think about the previous one, right? Your previous relationship, you attracted that person into your life, right? You went through something with them, you felt really connected with them, etc., but it didn't work out. Now, if you think back to who were you when you attracted that person, you're almost able to say, wow, I was this individual who attracted that individual. So already that's one reflection that you're able to get, that, okay, the relationship came in and the relationship was a certain kind of way because I was a certain kind of way. Next question. What were our interactions like? What were our discussions like? How did we challenge each other? Now, in a lot of cases, if you're able to identify and say, okay, my partner is someone who has they were very withdrawn. They were someone who was like very isolated. They didn't really talk to me. They didn't really emotionally connect with me. Then you're able to reflect on two things. One is you say, okay, then that means those things are important for me. Because if they weren't important, you would have just let them go, right? You wouldn't even have noticed that they're not available for you emotionally. But you notice they're not available for you emotionally because that's what's important to you, being emotionally available. So that's already two reflections. Now, you can break down that question into a further, deeper inner work question, which is then, why did I attract someone like that into my life? That's also a really good reflection after breakup. And the reason that happens is if something that we want or desire inside is not being met internally. So if the inner child's needs are not being met internally, the ego tries to create a dependency externally. You see, so if the inner child wants like love, validation, connection, and the inner child is the little being inside you that lives from like when you were really small through your conditioning, through all the wounds that you went through, the inner child had those basic needs of love, connection, attention, support. And if their needs, even now as an adult within you, are not being met, the ego now tries to attract someone who replicates very much what your parents, your caregivers, etc. did, so that it can try and depend on them to give it to you. But the conundrum here and the irony is such that whoever you attract will represent the same kind of person from your childhood who didn't give it to you. Do you know why that is? Think about it for a second. Whoever I attract in my life, if I'm really seeking those things externally, whoever I attract will represent the same type of energy or personality as the person in my childhood who didn't give it to me. You know why that is? It's because that is a way that your internal system is trying to remind you that you need to do that healing yourself. You need to be able to provide it yourself. And until you wake up and realize that, I'm going to keep attracting people who reject you, who kind of break up with you, who don't possibly give you that kind of emotional validation and affection that you're yearning for so much. So that's why this time after you break up becomes so important, because then you say, okay, I don't want to attract that kind of person in my life again who emotionally invalidates me. I don't want to attract that kind of person in my life again who's not present for me. So what is my need right now? My need is that I need to feel loved. I need to feel fulfilled. I need to feel connection. So let me take this time while I'm single to be able to give it to myself more and more. When you start doing that for yourself, the first thing that you do is you start committing to acts or things that you really enjoy doing. So cooking with affection and love, and not just cooking to eat, going for really long walks with yourself and just talking to yourself, enjoying yourself, celebrating yourself is a really big one. Celebrating your small wins, your big wins, connecting with people who value you and not people whose attention you necessarily need. All of these things now show your inner child that you are willing to show up for them, that they can now create a dependency on you so that you don't need to create that dependency on the external. You see? Because now you are meeting the needs of the inner child, so therefore you don't need to get those needs met by somebody externally. So therefore you're not going to attach yourself to someone externally. So now what happens is you attract someone into your life who, in two ways. One, not only are you not depending on them like excessively for them to validate you, give you those needs, make you feel important, validate your emotions, make you feel like you are the most important thing in the world. So not only are you not depending on them to do it, it's nice that you ask them and they may give it to you, from time to time, but you're not depending on it. And two, they're not under the pressure to be able to give it to you either. And so you start attracting someone who's more capable to give it to you out of freedom rather than feel that you depend on me for this, so therefore I must give it to you. And that's ultimately how we reach more security within our own relationships. And that's why, again, coming back to that point, that taking the time off between relationships becomes really important, where we can assess and we can evaluate for ourselves, what did that previous relationship teach me? One of the biggest things that I could tell you about that time after a breakup, before you get into the next relationship, one of the most important things that you can do in that space is to discover your patterns. I had someone reach out to me recently, and they were texting me and they were asking me, this is actually a friend of mine who was reaching out for just some help, just some connection. And they were talking about connecting with women, and they reminded me of a pattern that I had, which is where when I was with someone for a long period of time, I would attract a woman who, this was in my past by the way, I would attract someone into my life who wouldn't challenge me necessarily emotionally, and who just basically accept all of what I was like offering them. And this is not necessarily in a good way. They would accept all of my bullshit. And the reason that I attracted these kind of people was so that I could step into a place where I could get away with a lot of bullshit, and they would just say, oh, this is what he does, this is who he is, we'll accept this relationship. And my pattern in that relationship was then, if I wasn't feeling emotionally validated naturally, because I wasn't feeling really challenged by this person, I wasn't feeling really connected to this person, which is why obviously I settled and she settled, but I would constantly try and get this externally with other people. And I'd constantly try and like attract someone else into my life. And whenever I was going to a bar, if I was with my friends, instantly I'd seek connection. If I was going out and I was at the airport and like my eyes met another person, instantly I'd go out and I'd seek it. And so for me, when I ended this relationship, what was really helpful was to see, am I still attempting to seek those same things? Am I still attempting to attract those same things? And I was. I really was. And so when I got into a relationship with the next person, I noticed like in the beginning, it's all like, fireworks, it's great, you feel like all of this connection. And then later on, I started noticing that, okay, I'm finding this person appealing, I'm finding this person appealing, and I'm wanting to go out and make connection with them. That says two things for me in that moment. It says that perhaps I'm not feeling like there's a strong enough connection in my relationship right now, and I've attracted it just for a feeling of safety, just so I can feel like, okay, I am not alone, just so I can be with someone, but the connection is not potent enough, which is making me want these things. So that's part one. And part two, it's telling me that I have an excessive need of validation from people externally that clearly I'm not giving it to myself. And no person actually that I can be with can give me that level of validation, because the first person whose validation and sense of security I need is my own. And so what's going to happen in that situation, let me tell you, this is how narcissism is born, right? I was a narcissist for sure, and so that was exhibiting that trait of it. But this is how narcissism comes to being, is that you need such a strong sense of external validation and approval, so much so that you're willing to emotionally manipulate people all around you to be able to get it. And it's because your sense of security in that position or in that place or internally is so low that you need to falsely depict the sense of confidence, the sense of charm, the sense of like flirtatiousness, all of that, because that is what makes you feel more valid as a person. Again, I track this back to the time after a breakup, because if you don't take this time after a breakup to discover these things about yourselves, then you just slip into the next relationship with the same pattern. You attract a very similar person, maybe a little more evolved, maybe a little more receded, depending on how you're moving in your inner workspace. But you attract the same type of relationship and it leads to the same type of result. So for me, the biggest and one of the greatest gifts, I tell my students on the Gauntlet class, the greatest gift I've ever had was that I was with this girl for 6 years, the same girl who I felt very deeply for, but obviously I did all kinds of bullshit in that period of time that I definitely know how much I put upon her by doing that. And the greatest thing is that in this relationship, I was the dominant individual who kept deciding and dictating how the relationship would go. And the one decision she really made was the relationship right at the end, to end the relationship. And that was the best decision she could have made for her and for me, because that allowed her to be able to recognize for herself, like, what the fuck did I attract into my life? And it allowed me, when I was on my ass at that moment, to be like, what the fuck did I just do? And I spent that whole period of time after that relationship in so much pain, but introspecting, why the hell would I do that? Like, why would I want to say I'm with someone and then try and like physically connect with everybody else around? That just doesn't make sense. Why would I not only want to put someone else through that? Why would I want to put myself through it? Through all the guilt, the shame, all the negative emotions that I don't really need to hold on to that are plaguing me. Why would I want to go through that extent of doing that? And that's what allowed me to dig in and say, it's not just because I'm a sex addict, which is, honestly, a lot of people have asked me about this, but sex addiction is just a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism to deal with an insecurity of physical connection that we can't seem to establish because we're prioritizing all kinds of other things in our lives instead of prioritizing ourselves, our needs, and the connection that we truly desire. And so the moment I did that and I worked through it, obviously the next relationship wasn't necessarily magical, but they started to work upwards, bit by bit, evolving. And in each of those relationships, I started to recognize that when I spent time working through and introspecting what my needs were, and I spent time working through and understanding what my own need was in this relationship for myself, not just with the other person, I started to attract people who were more capable of just reflecting that back to me, not giving it to me necessarily and me not depending on them, but I started to get back people, to get relationships into my life, which started to reflect back that I am more capable of getting this myself, and therefore we're able to connect with between us on a much more authentic level, physically, emotionally, all of those things, because I'm not depending on someone, I'm not putting pressure on them, I'm not putting them under the fire to be able to achieve this, and also I'm able to give so much more of this to myself. So that's just what I wanted to talk to you, a few things about the value of time after a breakup.